In one of our earlier episodes, we have presented an argument in defense of free will skepticism. The argument suggested that people probably do not have free will in any interesting sense of the word. For this episode, let us assume that this is correct. Such a view has far-reaching consequences. If people do not have free will, they do not deserve to be blamed or praised for their actions. What is more, that would mean that people do not deserve to be punished for their wrongdoings. But that's just absurd, isn't it? We cannot simply abolish the criminal law. Or can we? Well, that's a philosophical question. Some philosophers who are skeptical that we have free will have seriously entertained the idea of abolishing the criminal law because of that. Without free will, we don't deserve blame, and if we don't deserve blame, we certainly don't deserve punishment. The notion of desert is closely related to retributive justifications of criminal law. Retribution is the idea that offenders deserve to suffer simply because they did wrong. But retribution is of course not the only reason why we punish offenders. The most famous alternative is deterrence. We want people to stick to the laws, and deterrence is a way to achieve the same, even if people don't strictly deserve to suffer for their wrongdoing. The idea of deterrence is straightforward. We punish offenders in order to stop them from committing crimes in the future. Nice and simple. This type of deterrence is called specific deterrence, because it focuses on deterring the offender who committed the wrong specifically. Besides that, there's also general deterrence. The idea here is also familiar. We punish offenders in order to deter other would-be criminals in our society. By punishing offenders for breaking the law, we communicate to all other people that they will suffer the same fate if they decided to violate the law, so they're better off not even attempting to do so. Deterrence theories don't presuppose that the offender has free will. The argument here is not that we punish offenders because they deserve it, but because it will make society safer. And as long as offenders or would-be offenders are able to react to the threat of punishment, we are good to go. Now, what's wrong with deterrence? Well, potentially a lot. First of all, it's not even clear that people accurately react to threats of punishment. There's more evidence to the contrary. People highly underestimate the likelihood of being caught by the police. It is also unclear how big the effects of deterrence really are. A little bit of punishment does seem to have deterrent effects, but a lot of punishment does not bring about lots of deterrence. Those are problems that criminologists research. As this is a philosophy channel, let's focus on the moral problems of deterrence. Let's start with general deterrence. The main objection here is that offenders are used as mere means to an end. If we punish offenders so that other people are afraid to commit crimes, we treat the punished offenders in morally problematic ways. As Immanuel Kant put it, we should never treat people as mere means, but always also as ends in themselves. To put it a bit simpler than Kant would, we all are typically really upset if we find out that other people have used us only as a means to their own ends. And if we are upset about such experiences, offenders should be so too. So maybe general deterrence is unappealing, but what about specific deterrence? Things are equally bad here. If all petty theft can be deterred by threatening thieves with lifelong incarceration, why not go for it? Or, on the other hand, if offenders pose no danger to society after committing a serious murder, what's the point in punishing them? In short, specific deterrence allows for disproportionate punishment, and that's bad. Much more could be said in defense of deterrence, of course, but we want to focus on something slightly different for this video, so let us assume that these moral problems are serious enough to be skeptical of deterrence. In that case, the most famous justifications for punishment really do not seem to work. Retribution doesn't work because people don't deserve to suffer if they don't have free will. Deterrence doesn't work because it leads to immoral punishment. In light of these objections, should we abolish the criminal law? After all, we can't just let people commit crimes as they wish. Here, we can ask those philosophers who proposed abolishing the criminal law in the first place. They present us an alternative model, the public health quarantine model. When people carry dangerous and contagious diseases, we have good reasons to quarantine them. Everyone watching this in 2021 will likely have flashbacks hearing this. In some cases of infectious diseases, we might even be justified to quarantine a person in a hospital for as long as that person remains contagious. But in less dangerous cases, such a restriction of freedom would not be justified. When confronted with the common flu, quarantining someone is not justified at all. It is important to note that none of the quarantined people necessarily deserve to be quarantined. So, what's the argument then for quarantining infectious people? It's justified because we have a right to self-defense. So what's the analogy to criminal offenders then? The idea is not to say that criminals should be seen as carrying diseases. The point is that we're justified in defending ourselves from dangerous people, in the same way we're justified in defending ourselves from infectious people. How does quarantining criminals look like? Imagine we are confronted with an offender who has committed assault. Punishment is out of the picture according to the abolitionist, but the offender might pose a threat and we have a right to defend ourselves against that threat. So we could be justified to impose house arrest on the offender, or put him under surveillance, or order him to try rehabilitation. Justifying incarceration is harder within this model, and we would certainly not be justified in putting them in awful prisons. Quarantine models of criminal law are committed to the principle of least infringement, which holds that the least restrictive measure should be taken to protect public safety. Take the example of people with diseases. We don't just toss them into prisons without the possibility to have some form of contact with their families. We can also allow them all forms of entertainment. The same, then, should be true for criminals. What the quarantine model comes down to is this: protect yourself against criminals, but with the least infringing means. Try to help offenders to be better in the future with the help of therapy if that's possible. And also try to prevent crime by addressing poverty, misuse of drugs, mental health issues, and other structural causes of criminal behavior. None of these are punishments in the strict sense of the word, even though they might entail coercive actions by the state. So that's the quarantine model of criminal law in a nutshell. If this account is plausible, we can still account for criminal wrongdoing without free will and without punishment in the strict sense of the word. But you'll likely already have some objections in mind, so let's take a look at potential problems. The first problem we want to look at states that a quarantine model of criminal law cannot respect proportionality. And if we already argued that ignoring proportionality is a reason to dismiss deterrence theories, then the same should be true for quarantine models. Why would quarantine models violate proportionality requirements? To put it short, the length or severity of the quarantine order or rehabilitation an offender needs depends not on how grave the wrong is, but on how dangerous the offender is. If offenders are not dangerous anymore after committing a murder, we don't have any reasons to quarantine them. On the other hand, people who didn't commit grave wrongs but appear dangerous might have to be quarantined for a long time. The philosopher Greg Caruso has several responses to this objection. He first notes that from an empirical perspective, free will skepticism actually corresponds to more lenient treatment of offenders. In studies, people who are primed to be skeptical about free will tend to give more lenient sentences than people who believe in free will. Against the suspicion of the critic, then, we should in practice expect less disproportionate reactions to wrongdoing within the quarantine model. More importantly, Caruso and his colleague Dirk Pereboom note that the public health quarantine model has its own form of proportionality built into the account. The way we treat criminal offenders has to be attuned to the actual threat they pose, and we should react with the least harmful action that can prevent the danger. That's true in other cases of self-defense too. You're only justified in using the amount of force or harm that is necessary to defend yourself against the threat. Thus, the quarantine model doesn't run into proportionality worries. Well, sort of. It has to bite the bullet that someone who isn't dangerous after committing a grave wrongdoing does not need to be incarcerated. We'll let you decide whether this should be regarded as a problem. But there are more problems. Here, we want to focus on the role of the victim in quarantine models. The objection states that because the quarantine model supposedly only focuses on the dangerousness of the offender, it misses the role of the victim. So, does the quarantine model ignore victims? According to Caruso and Pereboom, it does not. It's true that the offender cannot be blamed or punished if they, and we all, lack free will and thus responsibility. But there's more to morality than blame. Let us annoy you with some philosophical jargon. Responsibility in the sense we've talked about is commonly referred to as accountability, But besides accountability, there's also attributability and answerability. We know, seems like too many unnecessary philosophical distinctions. But in this context, the conceptual differences really help to understand the various facets of morality. The philosopher David Shoemaker designed a nice chart to oversee these differences. Attributability concerns the offender's character and correlates with emotional experiences such as disdain, contempt, or awe and admiration in positive cases. Even if you are skeptical of free will, you can still evaluate the character of a friend, offender, or a group. You can admire your friend's support for refugees or feel disdain because an offender's racist character. Answerability concerns a person's judgment and corresponds to emotions such as disapproval and disappointment, or in the positive case, appreciation and approval. Even if free will is out of the picture, we act for reasons, and we can ask offenders about the reasons that motivated them to act. If these were bad reasons, such as "I think people with a certain skin color are morally less valuable," we can disapprove of them. Because we still have attributability and answerability, even if we reject accountability, we can make an argument why the victim matters in criminal law within the quarantine framework. Caruso suggests offering victims and offenders restorative settings to address wrongdoing. In such settings, victims and offenders are given the chance to meet under controlled circumstances with a trained facilitator and the family of either party. Victims have the chance to voice the impact the wrongdoing had on them and inquire into the reasons the offender had or the character they displayed. Similarly, offenders get the chance to reflect on their character and their reasons for acting. It has been shown that restorative justice procedures benefit both victims and offenders. But don't victims want more than just the opportunity to confront the offender without being allowed to blame them? Don't they insist on a right to punish offenders, which would lack in the quarantine framework? Well, things are not so obvious here. Even though it is intuitive to think that people crave revenge and punishment, the data suggests a more complicated picture. Caruso refers to a national survey by the Alliance for Safety and Justice, which found that victims of violent crimes actually want shorter prison sentences, less spending on prisons, and greater focus on rehabilitation. That's certainly suggestive evidence, but it needs to be treated carefully. Even though a significant proportion of victims didn't focus on punishment, some still did. And if that is so, the objection at least partially applies. The quarantine model cannot do justice to all the victims' desires. But it's of course an open question how much weight we should give to vengeful desires. So, should we abandon criminal law if we reject free will? In a certain sense, yes. We should dismiss retributive arguments because they are incompatible with free will skepticism. And we should reject deterrence justifications of punishment on independent moral grounds. But that might not be too bad. We can prevent wrongdoing with other means. Based on a right to self-defense, we can quarantine and rehabilitate offenders. Instead of focusing on punishment, we can focus on preventing criminal behavior with investments in mental health, education, and other programs. But a quarantine model, of course, still collides with our partially punitive attitudes. How much this clash speaks against a quarantine model is up for further debate.